this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. When you're a death investigator, particularly a medical legal death investigator, you wind up going to places that other people don't have the opportunity to go to. You see things that, the common folk out there really don't get an appreciation for. And let me give you an example. I've had a number of cases over the course of my career that have involved industrial sites. I've gone to a variety of different factories over the course of my career because of accidents most of the time. Every now and then you'll get a homicide, perhaps at some big plant somewhere. But most of the time when I go to these places, it's always some big bit of industry. You name it, I've been there. Coal plants, auto plants, textile mills. And you begin to think about things when you get in there, because it's so massive. You might drive by it going down the street and you never really realize how vast the interior of one of these factories is. And it's always described. It's always described in terms of in industry, an industrial complex. Imagine, if you will, if death and disposal of human remains were described in terms of almost industrial size operation. Today on Body Bags, we're going to chat a bit about a discovery in our neighbor's country to the south, Mexico, that is so horrific that it brings back memories over 80 years ago of places that were found in Europe that disposed of humans. The horror is unbelievable. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, the thing about it is, when you look at a case or cases that we're going to be talking about today, I wish we had names. I really do, because unfortunately we don't. This is one of those oddball cases where we don't necessarily have a specific name of anyone. To this point, this investigation is still ongoing, but because you and I both like to honor the dead. If anybody says anything about this show, one of the things that we'd like to do is pay respect to the dead, because sometimes they have no respect paid to them at all. Maybe a word from us is one thing, but in this case, we don't really have that. And the volume that we're talking about here is mind blowing. When I, pitch this case to you as part of, part of what we're doing, our catalog here at Body Bags. I don't know if you were shocked by the scale of it. I was, and I'm pretty jaded, dude.
Joe, when it comes right down to it, I am shocked by what we're seeing, but more than anything else, I'm shocked by the lack of reaction. And it's interesting in that during World War II, at the end of the war, when the Allied troops were liberating some of the camps, the soldiers were so shocked by what they were seeing. It was just devastating. And I remember stories of how the people who lived in a nearby town of one of the, I don't know if it was Buchenwald or I don't know which concentration camp it was, but it had been in operation for some time, and the townspeople acted like they didn't know anything was going on. And so the Army actually marched them through to make them look at what was happening in their own backyard, that they ignored, that these were human beings who had been turned into ash. And reading stories of that, well, you would think, we're 70 years removed from that. And yet here we sit with the same thing happening. But now this death on an industrial scale is being done by cartels, drug cartels, just south of our border. I don't know why there is not more of a humanitarian cry. What are we doing here? Why are this one particular camp? It is just one, Joe. It is just one. And it was found, or actually publicly found, by a group that calls themselves a volunteer group led by a woman named Indira Navarro. It's called the Jalisco Search Warriors. That's what they call themselves, the Jalisco Search Warriors. And their goal is to find the missing, to find out what happened to people who applied for a job somewhere and never came home, which is what happened in many cases. And it's been going on for a long time. Historically speaking, people going missing in Mexico has only been, the data has only been kept since like 1962. And in that time, 120,000 people in Mexico have gone missing. 120,000 people missing. I don't know how many we have in the U.S. since 1962, but I would think 120,000 people going missing is a big number.
Yeah.
And you might have to have an answer. And finding this camp, they found out that, well, the local police did find the camp. They found it back several months ago in September, where they arrested 10 people. They released 2 people who were there being held against their will, and they found a body wrapped in plastic. But they didn't go any further, apparently, until the Jalisco Search Warrior showed up. And then, we know what's going on. It's been followed by the New York Times and the Washington Post. And that's where, when you sent me this information, I started thinking, surely this has to be an overstatement of what they found, and it's actually an underplay.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I don't know that they have found. Well, there's no way you can't. If people think, let's go back to the example of the concentration camps in Europe. If people think that they found everything over there, you're fooling yourself, because they haven't. There are people that are gone that no one will ever know about, what actually became of them, but it was directly related to an individual camp. I submit to you the same thing is in practice here, where you only have, and look, as scientists, forensics, we only have what we have before us. We can't really speculate, particularly if we're going to go to court, about what could have been. However, I think that at the root of it, when you begin to think about the Jalisco province there, that area, and by the way, there is actually a cartel there named the New Generation Jalisco Cartel. I find it interesting that the families adopted that name. It takes a lot of guts.
It does.
Look, you and I can talk big and bold as much as we want to here, safely ensconced in America. However, you're down there, and it's a Wild West, brother. And, that you're going to go out as a family member, and certain, you just get to the point, I think, and particularly if you get a collective of families, what do we have in common? Well, our loved ones are missing. And Dave, we're not, and this is really one of the big sad things about it, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but we're not talking about adult military age males here. Though that's in the grouping, we've got small children whose remains have been found. So when you go from, and, I knew Dr. Clyde Snow, who, if for any of our friends out there that are not familiar with Clyde Snow, he's a guy that coined the phrase that I'm fond of. I teach a section on forensic anthropology. He coined the phrase called osteobiography, which you're telling the story of someone through their skeletal remains. It sounds rather simplistic, but back when he coined that phrase, it was rather revolutionary. And to that point, Dr. Snow went to Central America back in the 70s and in the 80s and did excavation on mass graves down there that were politically, some of this political stuff that was going on down there. But most of the people that they would recover out of those graves were military age males, and when you take up the skeletal remains out of the ground, there are certain metrics that you measure these remains by where, the forensic pathologist can ballpark, first off, what the sex is and what the age is. But Dave, we're talking about something now where you begin to see families, young women, children. There were children's toys found about. That when you start to talk about, and that's why the UN sponsors a lot of these things like Doctors Without Borders, forensic anthropologists are part of that many times. They'll go over and they'll do these mass grave recoveries. The word genocide begins to slip into the conversation, because it's one thing if you're fighting an enemy, say military age males, all right? But when you're going into homes and perhaps kidnapping and attempting to eradicate an entire family, it's much more, if anything can be more chilling, it certainly is. It begins to approach that. And all of these remains, such as they are, kind of bonded together there. And so kudos to these family members that went out there and began to search the grounds of a location like you had mentioned that the police had already been to, Dave.
Right. They just didn't look further. But now, are we really talking about being able to identify human beings from the ash, from the what's left over from the remains, the cremains rather? Or are we really going to have to make certain assumptions based on clothing, shoes left behind, the sizes, the types? We do know we've got this picture that has gone from this, and it shows pictures of clothing, but shoes in particular. You get children's sizes of shoes, women's shoes. We're not just talking about men, as you mentioned, that were somehow ran afoul of the cartel. We're talking about people who have been wiped out for whatever reason. And I don't pretend to know what goes into the thought process of a cartel when they're taking over an area. We know that based on what we have seen in the past, they rule, it's a life or death situation every day, and children are included in this. If you do not bend to their will, if you don't do what they tell you to do, they kill you, mainly because they don't want you ratting on them. Somebody who does not participate is the enemy. So is that what we're really looking at here? That these people were recruited to become part of the cartel in becoming foot soldiers or whatever they wanted, and they were given the opportunity to join or not. And if they decided, I'm not going to be a part of this, then they practiced their torture techniques and ways to murder on the people who wouldn't go along. Is that what we're dealing with? I'm curious, because that's what it looks like.
No, I don't think it's people that won't simply, it's not just a matter of using people that are eradicating people that are not going along. I think that death is utilized as a message. There are a number of accounts. It was actually portrayed in, for those that have actually seen the movie Sicario, the very first one. There's been two. I think they might do a third, but the Sicario, there's when they go to Juarez in the first part of that movie, you see corpses hung off of bridges and strung up by the neck, dead, in various stages of decay, because people are afraid to cut them down. They're sending a message with that. And listen, those people are not that you see, and I think one of the characters in the movie actually alludes to this, and this has been known for some time as part of the methodology. You don't necessarily have to be a direct threat to the cartel. Your mortal remains, Dave, and let that sink in. Your mortal remains are used as a big flashing decaying neon sign to those that are outside to beware, or you might wind up in the same condition. Dave, I want to get back to the families and their search for these remains. You had pointed something out to me in your production notes that really stuck with me, because I don't think that I have ever heard of this methodology as a forensic scientist that has spent a lot of time in the field looking for human remains. Is it true from what you're reading that this Halesko family group went out with metal rods searching beneath the earth looking for and how are they, what methodology are they applying here in order to facilitate this? It's mind-blowing.
Well, they don't have ground penetrating radar and things like that we expect here when we're dealing with an investigation. And as we mentioned, we are dealing with volunteers, and I'm so glad you pointed out that they even name themselves. These volunteers are truly warriors. They know what they're faced with, and yet they use the name Jalisco Search Warriors. I know I said Jalisco earlier. Sorry. Jalisco Search Warriors, because it's a knockoff of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And they're saying, this is who we are. We're going to do something. And knowing what they are faced with day in and day out, which is certain death at some point, and yet they go into this place that the police were in not that long ago, and they start discovering things that the police failed to look into. And they use a poker of some sort. And I made a note of it because I was thinking, are they... when we look at how one investigates something of this nature, how do you search layer by layer to know what you're actually looking for? We see archaeologists in movies and on TV and how they have, they got string going everywhere and pegs and they've marched it all out and they're using brushes and their fingers and, they're going all out. That's not what we have here. We've got a group of volunteers who are trying to find loved ones that they presume are dead, and they find these bones. And so they're starting to dig around, and they use a metal poker to actually stick in the ground, and they pull it out and they smell it to figure out what it is that is actually beneath their feet. Is there a certain smell of death that they are trying to smell that actually could be recovered in such a way?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it all depends on what you're looking for when you're doing a body recovery. And in this case, they don't know what they're dealing with, because, if you had ground penetrating radar out there and you were running over the surface, which, by the way, for those that have never seen ground penetrating radar, they used to look a lot like an old push mower, but they're a bit more compact now. And they relay data back to a central server, and that data that's being bounced back up to the machine is being translated, and you can pick up on different formations beneath the surface. But just to begin with, and it's something that we look for in modern body recovery, because you have to be very careful here, because I know most people think about archaeology, Indiana Jones.
Right.
When you're thinking about ancient archaeology, the layering that goes on is so deep, dependent upon, obviously, the strata will be so deep, dependent upon how many years back you're going. And so it'll be really packed down. The soil will be. Okay. So like you and I, we live in an area that was heavily populated by the name that the whites gave them, which was the Creek Indians. Okay. As a matter of fact, one of our local shopping centers, and you might be familiar with the story, they built a shopping center here, and there was a huge mound behind it, and they just assumed that it was a hill, and they cut into that hill and they took fill dirt out of it. Well, it turned out that it was actually an Indian mound. It's one of the great shames around here, having a considerable amount of Native American ancestry in my family tree. It was a real shame that they didn't do their due diligence in trying to understand that. But, when you see that, it just looks like a hill, okay? And that's the presumption that they went under. When we're talking about a fresh burial like this, and this is fresh, when we look at the broad time, when you compare it to ancient, we're not talking about the Mayans or the Aztecs or anything like that down in Mesoamerica. We're talking about people that have died just in the last few years. So one of the things that even a neophyte that's going out to search for remains, you're looking for what's referred to as turned earth. So on the surface of it, when we're surveying an area, the first thing we're going to look for is disruption of vegetation. That's one of the markers that you look for when you go out into an area. And it can be something very benign. Like, for instance, if you've got, and I know nothing about the flora in the Jalisco state there in Mexico. However, let's just say they've got some kind of particular scrub brush that's low growth and it's populating the entire area. Well, what's really fascinating, you can do this yourself. If you go out to an area and you've got a common nuisance weed that's growing, it very well, if you see a big area that's absent of that weed that is naturally occurring, there's an assumption that you can make saying, well, something has occurred in this specific area that vegetation no longer grows here or hasn't grown here in some time. Okay. So as a starting point, one of the things that you would look for is disruption of vegetation. And then you would look for uneven soil where it looks like somebody has put shovel to dirt or heavy equipment to dirt, and they've literally turned the soil. Because once you unpack soil, Dave, this is what gets me about people that bury bodies. Once you turn that soil, it is impossible to get that soil to get back to its natural configuration that took hundreds, maybe thousands of years. No one has put a tool to it in all of that time. And suddenly you think that you're going to mask that area by taking a shovel out of the shed and you're going to dig a hole and we're going to see it, it'll stand out. And it doesn't matter really. I submit to you, Dave, that you could go out there with a group of guys with, those tampers that they use that are kind of square. You see them on work sites. You get a whole team of guys out there and kind of tamping the soil around there. It's still not going to match up visually to what the rest of the naturally occurring area is. So, for these families that are going out there and they don't have access to this kind of technology like we have here or in other locations, you got to do what you got to do. And to take a metal rod and to begin to stick it into the soil and draw it out, first off, you're going to test the depth. How far down can you get that metal rod? Are you going to strike kind of a solid structure that's down below? Because if you've got decaying human remains that are below the surface, you're not really going to be able to say, okay, I just passed through human remains. You're really not going to feel it most of the time. But when you draw it out, there will be, depending upon how fresh dead the people are, there will be a foulness to this that you will certainly appreciate very, very quickly. And it's not going to smell necessarily like if you took the rod and placed it into the ground, you happened upon methane or something like that. It's not going to have that. It's not going to have a rotten egg smell to it. It will, in fact, or sulfur rather. It will have a very distinctive human decay smell to it, even mixed with the dirt, commingled with the dirt. And so that's what they're doing. And I can only imagine that you've got people out there. I've imagined these people with pieces of rebar, which is like, what you use to reinforce concrete with. And they're kind of walking abreast and they're kind of sticking these things in the ground. And they've got this organized to the point where somebody, and we do this still, when we're surveying an area, we will walk abreast at what we think is a dump site or a burial site. There'll be a team of us. We'll walk abreast, and when one person finds something, everybody halts. You don't progress beyond that, and you mark it with a flag. And in a rudimentary way, that might be what they're doing. This is an old-time skill that they're employing, before the days, that we had ground-penetrating radar. Somebody has experience that's out there looking for the dead. And this isn't their first rodeo either.
I keep picturing,
because there's method to the madness here.
Well, I'm picturing Yukon Cornelius, in Rudolph, when he took his pick and he'd throw it up and it would stick in the ice and he'd take it and smell it and lick it.
Yeah.
And it was like that was his
no
test.
gold.
I'm kind of picturing these guys the same way. They're picked, and I'm so glad you said rebar. I was trying to picture in my head what type of metal, and that actually does fit, because if you just go out to your backyard and you stick a piece of metal like that, like rebar, just see what you can do in your grass. It's not going down very deep.
No.
But if you go to an area where you were digging and where you were, planting something and you stick it in there, it's going to go in several inches. So that's your first indicator that you have soil, you've got an area. Isn't there a way when we're searching for bodies, and not we, but in stories you and I have covered, where law enforcement flies overhead and they can actually have an ability to see areas with infrared that have been disturbed, where you do have ground that has changed? Because you pointed out, you got thousands of years where it's been sitting there, nobody messing with it. Now all of a sudden it's been turned up. It is going to be different, scientifically speaking. Yeah,
and I'm glad you said that, because we go back to the Daybell case out in Idaho. How quickly she's on trial right now, I think.
I already forgot about that.
But we, early on when I saw that site, where they said, I remember I was live on the air when I saw it. And I talked about how that's a fire ring. I think I was on CNN when I saw it the first time. And I said, and that's a great disposal area. And it turned out that that's where Kaylee's remains were. My understanding was that they were doing drone flyovers relative to that area to try to map the area initially. Now, I don't know if that ever came to fruition, but that's one of the things that the authorities had at least leaked out at one point in time, that they were trying to get images to see where the soil has been disrupted in that area. And it was kind of plain. You didn't need, because, you look at Chad Daybell's property and it's pasture land, that block of land. It's like a paddock, what they call a paddock, where you keep horses and whatnot. It's kind of fenced in and all of that. You saw green grass growing, but in those areas, like I was referring to earlier, where Kaylee was found, and of course that little boy was found, that was like immediately adjacent to that tree, and an area that was like an old dried up retention pond, that soil had been turned. You can also do air sampling as well, to get an idea of what's decaying beneath the surface. Now, you don't know if you can't say with scientific certainty, which some people would have you believe. Think back to Casey Anthony, by the way. They'll say you can specifically, say that this is a human decomposing down there. No, you can't, because it might be any kind of animal, but at least you're in the neighborhood, when you're conducting an investigation. So they can do air sampling as well. But, these people are not going to have that kind of technology. This was sheer determination and elbow grease on the part of these families. And that's what's so touching and brutal about this. They're missing all of these family members. And, one of the things that really tugged at me when I saw it initially, when this case came up, if you didn't need any more emphasis here, because we're hearing stories about cremation ovens, we're hearing stories about particulate bone. We've heard rumors of children and toys, but the one thing that really stuck in my mind was an image that I saw many years ago when I visited the Holocaust Museum in D.C. It affected me to the point where I can't go back in there. And it was shoes, collected shoes, piles of them. You can't take the measure of it, but you can look at each pair and know that they represent someone who was loved. This Guerry Ranch. I'm looking at an image of it right now, and the reason I'm looking at this image is that there is a shot of a Mexican National Guardsman in full military kit standing outside of the gate. He's standing there, and when I say gate, I'm talking about a gate that has got the name emblazoned on the front of it. It's a steel gate. It's massive. And there are two dancing horses on the outside of it. It was within these walls that three crematory ovens were discovered. And you cannot run fast enough to sell me the story if they did not know what was going on inside of those walls, Dave. And one of the big things here is that people are terrified, even the authorities. We've known that for a long time. What went on the other side of those walls is horrific. I think my question is this still going on in other locations? Because this seems, the reason I think that it could potentially be is the fact that, Dave, based upon what we're hearing and seeing right now, they seem to have this down to a science. You know,
They
you go
got
to
the
the
ovens
trouble.
underground, Joe.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's not something you just come up with all of a sudden. This is through trial and error, just like the Nazis did during World War II when they were developing destruction of human beings on an industrial scale. They tried many different things. They started off just shooting everybody. You know, they'd have their soldiers shoot them, and they saw there was an emotional component to that actually was causing harm to their soldiers. So they then decided carbon monoxide. There are actually pictures of these long showers that were hooked up, and you've got cars with tailpipes, you know, extensions going into these buildings. That didn't work fast enough. I mean, they just kept developing it until finally they're like, you know what, we're going to poison them in the showers and just take the bodies right over here. These ovens, these three crematory ovens were all underground, which means they had to have piping to get the exhaust out.
Yep.
It's got to go somewhere.
Yes,
and
it does.
It's going to have a distinct, I'm guessing, a distinct odor. You're not going to be burning bodies down to, you know, just FYI, so you know this, when you get cremains back from, if it's a loved one and they've been cremated, I remember the first time seeing, I thought it was powdery like you see in movies where people, they spread ashes and they're really ashes. They just kind of float off into the ether. And that's not what you get. It's much different than that. Oftentimes there's teeth and bone fragments and things like that in the cremains. And that's what we're finding here. So we've got these three ovens underground that they're using to try to destroy evidence, being human beings. And I'm wondering, what can you get forensically out of the cremains, Joe? What's left behind? Is there a possibility of getting DNA?
Well, heat really compromises things. I think that would be very difficult. I think the best they're going to be able to do is probably aging of the remains. One of the big keys to that are going to be the teeth that you recover. And that's a real shame because you know, teeth are not bone, just so everyone understands that. Now, teeth are socketed in bone, you know, in our mandible and our maxilla, but they are not bone. Their composition is completely different, and they're more resilient. As a matter of fact, I think I've talked about it on body bags, but if you were to, you know, they talk about extracting DNA from long bones or, you know, like the head of the femur, that sort of thing. I talk about how if you were to think biologically of a conveyance or storage for DNA, bone would be a leather briefcase, and teeth would be a titanium briefcase. They're both serving the purpose of storing DNA, and you can collect them, but teeth are so resilient. When it comes, you get into the pulp and you can extract it from there. One of the components with a crematory, which we don't have evidence of right now, and I'm going to be very curious to find this out, Dave, is in crematories, I've seen two things. I've seen great big marble rollers that are at the end of the conveyor belt that come out of the ovens, and they run opposing. So as the remains go down, and this is really old timey here. I don't think anybody uses these anymore. They roll opposing, these big rollers, and they're essentially bone crushers, and they crush everything else that remains, and it's collected in a bin. Now they use an auger, which if you've ever seen an auger, which is kind of graduated, looks like a gigantic screw. That's used now to facilitate the crushing of the bones. Here at Jacksonville State, as a matter of fact, I've got a local funeral home that I take my death investigation class to, and they have a crematory there. And it's really profound for the students to walk in there and to see, and everything has dust on it. There's dust, when you walk in, and
it's not really dust, is it, Joe?
Well, yeah, it's there's a residue that is there, but that's part, there's nothing. I think people want to think that, death is so clean, and it's not. It's dirty business. It's very dirty business. And, with our cases that we're talking about today, with this, what the media has termed as a concentration camp, because it's not just the disposal of the remains. They found evidence of torture chambers there too, Dave, where I think part of what you said was really accurate earlier. They're trying to extricate information from somebody. Why else do you unless you're just a pure sadist and you get off on torturing people, which I'm not saying that these individuals may be. I have no idea. But when you think about the purpose of torture, you want to extract information from people. And there's evidence that this had been ongoing in this area. And what information could a child have? Unless their torture is being used as a way to elicit information from maybe an adult that's, maybe a parent or something, which again is very chilling. And all of these remains are being found commingled. So one of the problems that you're going to encounter, if in fact all the remains have been cremated, because some of them very well may not have, and so you might have those that are buried in certain locations, going back to this probe that they're using to go down into the earth. You might have people that were intact when they were buried, and that's going to give you a clue, because you can, everything is like investigatively is like if people will just envision in their mind an inverted funnel. So as you get closer to the apex of it, the top of it, if you've got looks like a mountain peak, your information is slowly beginning to narrow down. And if you have an intact body where you can get sex, age, race, those elements, you might have a shot at getting them identified. And that they're not part of the cremains. And if there are other people in that intact body, if there are members of their family that are still missing, then one of the assumptions you can make investigatively is they may have been cremated. And you might not find them there on the compound or elsewhere, where they've been discarded. So, at the end of the day, though, when you have these cremated remains that are literally commingled, you're going to have bone chips that are thrown together. Well, you can pretty easily separate adolescent, pre-adolescent skeletal remains from adult remains. It's going to be really hard, though, to narrow down age ranges. If you've only got certain elements, like if you've got for instance, when we grow, for instance, we have these epiphyseal plates that, where you get the growing pains and that sort of thing, where it's not completely fused yet. That's one of the things that we look for in children, to see if their bones are completely fused. If they've gone beyond that, then we can hang a number on that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can get them identified beyond putting them specifically into an age group. There's no guarantee that you can say, well, this person is this particular age. And you can't certainly distill it down into anything more fine than that to say it is this person.
And you can't even do that with cremains. You got cremains, you can't do any of that.
Yeah. No, the only thing that I was really thinking about here, Dave, is that the thing about the teeth. Teeth are a great identifier. They're a grand identifier. If you do have a DNA database and you can harvest out of the pulp, if you can, and again, that's going to be a long shot because even the teeth are exposed to tremendous heat. A regular crematory, will blast away 1,500, 1,600, 1,700 degrees. And depending upon the size of the individual, it takes some time to render them down. And this is we talked about this being an industrial scale. So and by the way, they have no idea as to how many bodies there actually are. That's what's so terrifying about this. These investigators, if they are so inclined, need to get their pencil and paper out, go to those ovens and write down any serial numbers that are on there. When were they constructed? When were they purchased? That might give you an indication as to when all of it started, unless they were handmade, which, is certainly a possibility. People do fabulous, metal work and that sort of thing. Is that something, and were they automated to the point where you had a movable belt in there, where it's drawing the remains, through the oven after they've been rendered down at that point in time? There's so many things that they could do, though, investigatively to try to time frame this thing out. And if you've got people that have facilitated and built this thing underground, Dave, that takes a special skill set. You're not just going to go out on the street and say, hey, can you dig a big hole for me? I'm going to build, a multi-flue crematory subterranean. Can you help me with that? You're looking for somebody that would have that capability, from ranging from everything to plumbing, to heating, to metalwork. It's high-end labor.
When you look at this, Joe, and I hate to interrupt you here, but It just occurred to me, one of the things that we learned from the group, the Jalisco Search Warriors, is that the gang, the drug cartel, the gang would actually use phony employment advertisements to lure men to a Guadalajara bus station. The gang members would meet them there with the idea they're going to get a job and take them to one of the extermination camps. I say camps because I cannot imagine this being the only one. It's just the only one they found so far that they're willing to talk about. But if they were looking at doing something, and you just mentioned metalwork, plumbing, things like that. What if they were advertising for that to lure these people in? They have them do the job at gunpoint or whatever, make them do, and then they're the first victims to go through the new crematorium that's been subterranean, that has been created underground. It's just a thought, because that is one thing we do know.
It's a grand idea, because now you don't have the individuals that initiated the construction of it to go out and blab about it. You kill them and you liquidate them, essentially. Wow. And then if you need other maintenance done, then that's just something that's going to be on you and your posse that will get that knocked out, over time. And they would have to have test subjects for it, to see if it actually worked, which is horrific in and of itself. The other thing that we're kind of missing here is, how are these folks being taken out? If you go back again to our example of the Nazi concentration camps, those things were done on mass scale. Well, I don't think that we're approaching those numbers, obviously, but you're in the tens of people here, maybe the hundreds of people. you begin to think, well, bullets are cheap, all right? And if it's a single shot to the back of the head, that doesn't really, cost a lot in order to, meeting your bottom line. Are they killing them in other ways? Do they torture them to death, for instance? Are these fatalities, occurring while they're in some kind of dungeon that's been, where they're tied to the wall, and you've got evidence of bloodletting that has been going on in this environment. This case, these cases in particular, they are, as you said from the top, Dave, these are evidence-rich environments, bathed in forensic science, or elements where forensic science can be applied, and you can figure these things out. Everything from forensic engineering to dentistry to pathology to archaeology, anthropology. I know I'm missing some, but here's the rub, as they say. The rub is, your samples exist. There's science to process the samples. But do the governmental authorities possess the will to do it right? I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.